October 14th, 1982. The Fulda Gap. A landscape of rolling hills and dense, dark forests, pregnant with the expectation of violence. For 40 years, this slice of West German countryside was the designated graveyard of armies, the place where the Third World War was expected to begin and perhaps end. On this day, under a sky the color of wet concrete, it became the stage for an impossibility. The 8th Guards Army of the group of Soviet forces in Germany was a magnificent, brutalist machine. It was designed for one purpose: to punch through NATO lines like a fist through plasterboard. It would advance 100 kilometers a day, an unstoppable tide of steel, drowning Western Europe in the red wash of Soviet operational art. The doctrine was called deep battle. It was a philosophy of mass, momentum, and unrelenting pressure. On this particular morning, a forward reconnaissance battalion was conducting a live-fire exercise, a spear tip probing a hypothetical enemy line. The column consisted of 20 T-72 main battle tanks and a handful of BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles. They moved with the arrogant confidence of a force that knew it outnumbered its opponent 3-1 in every category that mattered. The crews were veterans of the Ogaden and Afghanistan, hard men and hard machines. The exercise was monitored from a command post 5 kilometers behind the line of advance. General Major Ivan Volkov watched the map, a constellation of blue icons inching across the terrain. His headphones crackled with the routine chatter of unit commanders. Reports were nominal. Fuel states were green. Ammunition counts were confirmed. Everything was as it should be. The plan was working. The machine was functioning. Then, at 9:47 hours, the chatter stopped. Not a sudden scream of panic. Not a desperate call for fire support. Just silence. A dead space on the net where a dozen confident voices had been moments before. Volkov tapped his headset. He assumed it was an equipment malfunction. Communications in the field were notoriously fickle. He barked an order to his signals officer. Get them back. Now, the signals officer worked his console, his face a mask of professional calm. No response, Comrade General. From any of them. The entire net is dead. A cold knot tightened in Volkov's stomach. A communications failure across an entire battalion simultaneously? Impossible. It suggested a catastrophic, coordinated event. An enemy action. But there were no enemy forces in the exercise zone. American units were 30 kilometers to the west, snug in their barracks. There had been no artillery reports. No sound of air attack. A forward observation post, perched on a wooded ridge overlooking the valley, was patched through. The spotter's voice was thin, strained. Comrade General. I can see them. The column. They've stopped. Stopped, Volkov demanded. Why have they stopped? Are they engaging a target? No, Comrade General, the voice trembled. They are just sitting in the middle of the field. The engines are off. I see no smoke. No fire. Nothing. For 20 minutes. The command post was a nexus of frantic, useless activity. Calls went out that were never answered. The map remained frozen, its blue icons mocking them with their stillness. Volkov felt a primal fear creep up his spine. This was not a malfunction. This was something else. Something new. He dispatched a recovery team, 2 BTR-80s filled with armed engineers and a political officer, their orders to approach with extreme caution. 2 hours later, their report came in. The voice on the radio was not that of a soldier. It was the voice of a man who had seen a ghost. Comrade General. We are here. We are at the lead tank, a long pause, filled with the sound of ragged breathing. The vehicle is undamaged. I repeat, there is no damage. No scorch marks. No impact craters. The paint is not even scratched. The crew, Volkov snapped, his patience gone. Report on the crew. The line was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then, the voice, now barely a whisper. We have opened the commander's hatch. The crew. Comrade General. The crew is dead. All of them. They are sitting in their seats. Their eyes are open. There are no wounds. No blood. They are just gone. The report was the same for all 20 tanks. And for the BMPs. Over 100 trained soldiers had perished in an instant, without a single shot being fired. They had died inside their sealed steel tombs, killed by a phantom. The great armored fist of the 8th Guards Army had been paralyzed by a whisper. The machine had not crashed. It had been turned off. In the quiet German valley, The pristine, silent tanks stood as monuments to a new and terrible form of warfare. They were tombs. And inside the command post, the men who commanded them stared at their maps in profound, sickening confusion. The laws of war, as they understood them, had just been repealed. The incident in the Fulda Gap was not contained. It could not be. A report like that, pristine tanks, dead crews, no explanation, does not travel up the chain of command. It explodes. It was a data bomb that detonated in the heart of the Soviet General Staff, the Stavka. The initial report was met with disbelief, then with accusations of incompetence and drunkenness on the part of General Major Volkov. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The bodies, flown back to a secure military morgue in Moscow, confirmed the field reports. The forensic pathologists were baffled. They found massive, system-wide cellular disruption. The nervous systems of the soldiers had been flash-cooked, boiled in their own skulls. Yet there were no entry wounds, no signs of poison, no detectable radiation signatures beyond the faint, residual background hum of the German soil. This was no longer a tactical problem. It was a strategic nightmare. The entire military doctrine of the Soviet Union, the bedrock of its power and its projection of influence across the globe, was predicated on the unstoppable power of its armored forces. The Red Army was a hammer, designed to shatter the defenses of Western Europe through sheer mass and velocity. Generations of marshals and planners had perfected the art of the operational maneuver group, vast formations of tanks and mechanized infantry that would pour through any gap, overwhelming defenders by their ferocity and numbers. That doctrine was now dead. It had been rendered obsolete in a silent, bloodless instant. What good were 5,000 tanks if an invisible force could kill their crews at will? The hammer had been turned into an anvil, a static, helpless target waiting to be struck. The concept of deep battle relied on momentum. This new weapon, this phantom, was the perfect counter. It was a weapon of paralysis. It did not destroy. It simply stopped. It was a computer brought to a knife fight. The geopolitical implications were catastrophic. The Warsaw Pact's conventional superiority was the cornerstone of Soviet foreign policy. It was the brute force counterweight to NATO's technological and economic advantages. It was the implicit threat that kept West Germany pliable and France independent of American military command. Now, that leverage was gone. The balance of power had not just shifted, the entire chessboard had been overturned. The Kremlin looked west and no longer saw a battlefield it could dominate. It saw a kill zone. Fear, a far more potent contagion than any radiation, began to spread through the group of Soviet forces in Germany. The official explanation was a tragic training accident involving an experimental chemical agent. No one believed it. The truth, or what was imagined to be the truth, traveled in whispers between tank crews in their barracks, between pilots on the flight lines. They gave the phenomenon a name. They called it the Zona Tishiny, the zone of silence. It was spoken of like a supernatural force, a patch of cursed earth where American ghosts could reach through steel and stop your heart. Tankers began developing mysterious illnesses before field exercises. Morale, once ironclad, began to rust. The mythology of the invulnerable Soviet tank man was replaced by the paranoia of a man trapped in a steel coffin, waiting for an invisible executioner. The psychological armor of the Red Army was cracking. The high command was in a state of controlled panic. The most brilliant minds of the Soviet military-industrial complex were summoned to the Ministry of Defense. A special commission was formed, given the highest priority and unlimited resources. It was designated Directorate S for Spezial NYY, Special. Its mandate was simple and impossible: identify the weapon, understand how it works, and develop a countermeasure. Immediately, the fate of the Soviet state depended on it. Directorate S mobilized with terrifying efficiency. Within hours of its formation, teams of GRU technical intelligence specialists and scientists from the most secretive research institutes, the Sharashkas, were en route to East Germany. The entire valley where the incident occurred was cordoned off, declared a permanent military exclusion zone. It became a laboratory, a sealed crime scene 5 kilometers wide. Teams in heavy, lead-lined hazardous material suits moved with agonizing slowness through the fields, sweeping every square meter with an exotic array of sensors. They were hunting for a ghost, and they used every tool at their disposal. They collected soil samples, air samples, vegetation. They disassembled the stricken tanks bolt by bolt, laying them out in a massive hangar like the dissected corpses of iron dinosaurs. Every circuit board was examined under a microscope. Every millimeter of armor was scanned for microscopic fractures. They were searching for the signature of the weapon, the faint fingerprint left behind by the killer. The debriefings of the recovery teams and the observers yielded little. The men were terrified, their accounts bordering on the hysterical. They spoke of a strange feeling in the air, a low hum they could feel in their teeth, a sudden pressure in their ears just before communications were lost. These were the subjective, unreliable accounts of frightened soldiers, easily dismissed as battlefield stress. But they were all the investigators had. The victims themselves could not speak. The most critical evidence came from the autopsies. The chief pathologist of the Red Army, a man who had seen death in every conceivable form, presented his findings to Directorate S. His hands trembled as he pointed to the slides projected on the wall. They showed nerve synapses burned out, entire clusters of brain cells that had been subjected to an intense, instantaneous energy surge. "It is like a lightning strike," he explained, his voice hushed. "A lightning strike inside the skull. But there is no external point of entry. It is as if the energy originated from within the body itself." The evidence grew, but the mystery only deepened. The data was a mass of contradictions. Geiger counters had registered fleeting, high-energy neutron bursts, which suggested a nuclear event. But there was no lingering radioactive fallout, no gamma radiation, none of the telltale isotopic signatures of fission. The tank's electronics were fried, consistent with a powerful electromagnetic pulse, an EMP. But an EMP powerful enough to do that should have been accompanied by a massive explosion, a fireball visible for miles. There was none. Some of the dead crew members had trace amounts of vaporized metals in their lungs, suggesting an intense thermal event inside the tank. But the tank interiors showed no signs of fire. The fire extinguishers had not even discharged. It was impossible. It was a series of effects without a cause. Directorate S was drowning in facts that pointed nowhere. They had collected the pieces of a puzzle, only to find that none of them fit together. The analysts of Directorate S were brilliant men. They were the products of a system that prized scientific materialism and rigid, logical deduction. They did not believe in ghosts or magic. Every effect had a cause. Every problem had a solution that could be engineered. But they were also prisoners of their own doctrine and industrial reality. Their minds ran on well-worn tracks. When confronted with a phenomenon that defied their experience, they did not seek a new track. They tried to force the phenomenon onto the existing one. They were looking for a weapon, a bigger gun, a more powerful bomb, a more exotic ray. The committee room was thick with smoke and fear. The pressure from the Politburo was immense. The marshals demanded answers. The analysts, trapped between the inexplicable data and the demands of their political masters, did what all bureaucracies do under pressure. They sought the most plausible explanation that fit within their worldview, even if it did not fit all the facts. They latched onto the one piece of data that seemed familiar, the neutron bursts. This led them down a terrifying but intellectually comfortable path. The magic bullet they settled on was the American Enhanced Radiation Weapon, known colloquially as the neutron bomb. The concept had been a boogeyman of Soviet intelligence for years. A tactical nuclear device designed not to blast, but to irradiate. It would produce a massive, lethal wave of neutron radiation with a relatively small explosion, killing soldiers and civilians while leaving buildings and infrastructure and captured tanks intact. It was seen as the ultimate capitalist weapon. It destroyed people but preserved property. The theory was seductive because it explained the most shocking parts of the incident. It explained the dead crews in the undamaged tanks. It explained the neurological damage. It explained the fleeting radiation signatures. It was a monster, but it was a monster they understood. A bomb is a bomb. You can build a shield against a bomb. This became the dominant hypothesis, the official truth that Directorate S prepared to present to the General Staff. But other theories flourished in the fevered atmosphere of the investigation, each one a reflection of the Soviet state's own technological anxieties and obsessions. One faction, composed mainly of electronics warfare specialists, argued for a directed energy weapon. They theorized a ground-based or airborne microwave generator of immense power, capable of focusing a beam that could literally cook the crew inside their vehicle. This would explain the fried electronics and the thermal damage to the bodies. It was a weapon straight out of science fiction, but Soviet research into particle beams and high-powered microwaves was well advanced. They knew it was theoretically possible, and they feared the Americans had perfected it. A more fringe group, from the Acoustic and Biophysics Institutes, proposed a sonic weapon. They pointed to the survivors' reports of pressure changes and a low hum. They postulated a weapon that could generate a focused wave of infrasound, resonant frequencies that would cause fatal, explosive cavitation in soft human tissue. The body would literally be shaken apart from the inside. This theory was popular among those who wanted to believe in a non-nuclear explanation, as it seemed less apocalyptic. The KGB, always inclined toward the conspiratorial, pushed the idea of an advanced chemical or biological agent, a nerve agent of unimaginable potency, delivered as a colorless, odorless aerosol that could penetrate the tank's ventilation systems. It would kill instantly, leaving no trace. This theory was bolstered by the lack of physical damage to the vehicles, but it failed to explain the electronic failures or the specific type of neurological trauma. Finally, there was the most exotic and deeply unsettling theory, one that emerged from the shadowy institutes that studied parapsychology and what was termed psychotronics. These were the true believers in mind control rays and telekinetic warfare. They argued that the Americans had weaponized consciousness itself, creating a device that could project a lethal psychic field. This was dismissed as fantasy by the mainstream engineers, but the idea took root in the darker corners of the intelligence community. It was the ultimate expression of their fear, a weapon that attacked not just the body or the machine, but the mind itself. The neutron bomb theory won the day. It was the most conventional of the unconventional explanations. It was something the marshals could understand. And so, the entire might of the Soviet military-industrial complex was retasked to counter a phantom. Crash programs were initiated. Tank factories began experimenting with new armor composites, layering in lead and boron-impregnated plastics to block neutron radiation. These new layers added tons of weight to already heavy vehicles, ruining their performance, straining their engines and transmissions. New, more cumbersome NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical, suits were designed, with heavy shielding that made it nearly impossible for a crew to operate effectively in the cramped confines of a tank. New tactical doctrines were hastily written and disseminated. Armored formations were to be dispersed, abandoning the core principle of mass that was central to their strategy. This made them less vulnerable to a single area effect weapon, but it also made them ponderous, difficult to command, and unable to generate the focused combat power needed to achieve a breakthrough. They were actively making their army worse. They were crippling themselves in a desperate attempt to fight a ghost. The countermeasures were a perfect reflection of their flawed conclusion, a brute force, industrial solution to a problem they did not understand. They were building a thicker shield, not realizing the enemy was using a key. While Directorate S was chasing shadows in Moscow, the answer was being quietly assembled in a sterile, brightly lit laboratory in Southern California. There were no panicked marshals here, no clouds of cigarette smoke. There were only quiet, focused engineers in white lab coats, hunched over circuit diagrams and computer terminals. The room was filled with the low hum of cooling fans and the gentle clicking of keyboards. This was the womb of the phantom. The reality was not a single, terrifying superweapon. It was something far more subtle and far more revolutionary. It was not a new kind of bomb. It was a new kind of thinking. The Americans, haunted by the quantitative superiority of the Warsaw Pact, had made a generational bet. They knew they could never build more tanks than the Soviets. So they decided to build a system that would make every Soviet tank obsolete. The project was part of a grand strategic vision, a so-called offset strategy, designed to leverage America's one unassailable advantage, the microchip. The core innovation was not a warhead. It was information. The true weapon was a network, a distributed intelligence that acted like a single, predatory organism. It was a system of systems, a concept so alien to the top-down, centralized Soviet mindset that they were institutionally incapable of conceiving it. The first component was the eyes. a web of interconnected sensors that saw everything. High-altitude surveillance aircraft, not unlike the later AWACS, carried powerful look-down radars that could track hundreds of individual vehicles on the ground, even through cloud cover and darkness. Satellites provided real-time imagery. Unmanned drones and ground-based listening posts sniffed out electronic emissions. All this data, a torrent of information that would have overwhelmed any human command center, was fed into the second component, the brain. The brain was a new generation of ruggedized battlefield computers. They were packed with microprocessors, tiny slivers of silicon that represented a quantum leap in processing power. These computers did not just display data, they fused it. They took the inputs from dozens of different sensors, correlated them, and built a single, coherent, real-time picture of the entire battlefield. The software, driven by sophisticated algorithms, could identify formations, prioritize high-value targets like command vehicles and air defense systems, and calculate optimal firing solutions in fractions of a second. The system could think faster than any general. The final component was the claws. This was the part the Soviets had mistaken for the entire beast. The system did not rely on a single, massive weapon. It used thousands of small, intelligent ones. The primary delivery system was a new type of artillery shell or an air-launched missile. But instead of a single high-explosive warhead, it carried a payload of dozens of smaller, smart submunitions. Each submunition was a miracle of miniaturization. It was a self-contained killing machine. After being dispensed over a target area, it would deploy a small parachute or winglets to slow its descent. As it fell, its sophisticated sensor, a combination of infrared and millimeter-wave radar, would scan the ground below. The microchip inside the submunition was programmed to recognize the specific heat signature and shape of a tank's engine and turret. When it detected a target, it would fire. The warhead was not an explosive charge in the traditional sense. It was a self-forging penetrator. An explosive lens would detonate, flash forging a concave copper plate into a hypersonic jet of molten metal. This laser beam of heavy metal, traveling at over 5,000 meters per second, would strike the thin top armor of the tank. It would punch through the steel as if it were cardboard, injecting a superheated, hypervelocity spray of metal and plasma into the crew compartment. This, then, was the solution to the mystery. The impossible event was demystified. There was no single, invisible blast wave. The Soviet battalion had been engaged by hundreds of these tiny, brilliant projectiles simultaneously. The system's central brain had assigned multiple submunitions to every single tank in the column, ensuring a total, instantaneous kill. The fleeting neutron bursts were the result of the intense energy release as the molten jet vaporized the tank's interior. The fried electronics were caused by the localized electromagnetic pulse from that same event. The neurological damage was the effect of a human body being flash-cooked by a plasma jet inside a sealed steel box. The small entry hole from the penetrator, often no bigger than a coin and located on the roof of the turret, was easily missed by the first panicked recovery teams. The zone of silence was not magic. It was mathematics. It was the brutal, elegant logic of a system that could see everything, think instantly, and kill with surgical precision from miles away. The Soviets were trying to build a better shield, while the Americans had built a million tiny, unstoppable spears and a brain that knew exactly where to throw them. The breakthrough for the Soviets came not in a laboratory, but in the mud and blood of a proxy war thousands of miles from Europe. In a dusty, forgotten conflict in Africa, a Soviet-backed army was fighting a Western-backed insurgency. The Americans supplied their allies with their latest weaponry, and on one occasion, a battery of these new advanced artillery systems was used against a column of Soviet-supplied T-55 tanks. The result was the same devastating, inexplicable paralysis that had been seen in Germany. But this time, there was a difference. One of the artillery shells was a dud. It fell harmlessly into a muddy riverbed. A team of Soviet Spetsnaz advisors, operating alongside the local army, heard the rumors of the devil weapon. Risking their lives, they mounted a covert operation to search the battlefield. After 2 days of probing the muck, they found it. A single, unexploded carrier shell. They carefully defused it and, under the cover of darkness, transported their priceless treasure to a waiting transport plane. Within 24 hours, it was in the hands of the engineers at Directorate S. The atmosphere in the lead-lined analysis chamber was electric. The chief engineer, a man who had dedicated his life to building bigger and stronger tanks, watched as his technicians carefully disassembled the American projectile. They removed the outer casing, revealing the payload, a cluster of small, canister-like objects, each one packed with delicate electronics. There was no massive warhead. There was no nuclear component. The Geiger counters in the room remained silent. They selected one of the submunitions and placed it in a shielded cradle. With remote manipulators, they began to take it apart, layer by layer. The first thing they saw was the sensor head. It was a complex jewel of gallium arsenide and exotic alloys, a marvel of manufacturing precision. Then they uncovered the circuit board. It was a dense, multi-layered tapestry of microscopic pathways and integrated circuits. The chief engineer stared at the central microprocessor through a magnified viewer. It was smaller than his fingernail, yet it contained more processing power than the room-sized mainframe computer that ran his entire institute. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold, professional dread that went beyond fear into a realm of pure, intellectual horror. The shock came in three distinct, crushing waves. The first was technological. "They can make this," he whispered to his deputy. "They could mass-produce microchips of this complexity and reliability. They could miniaturize radar systems to fit into an object the size of a soup can." This single, small object represented a level of solid-state physics and precision manufacturing that was a decade, perhaps two, beyond the Soviet Union's grasp. The second wave was industrial. The chief engineer knew his factories. He knew the clumsy, brute force methods they used. He knew the problems with quality control, the reliance on manual labor, the inability to achieve the microscopic tolerances required to build such a device. He looked at the American submunition, a product of automated, high-precision assembly lines, and then he thought of his own sprawling, inefficient industrial base. The realization was sickening. We cannot build this. Even if they stole the plans, they could not physically replicate it. The industrial gap was a chasm. But the third wave of shock was the most profound. It was philosophical. As they reverse-engineered the logic on the microchip, they finally understood. The submunition was not just a dumb projectile. It had a brain. It could make its own decisions. And then they realized that this was just one small piece. The true weapon wasn't the munition in their hands. It was the unseen network that had guided it. The satellite, the aircraft, the computer, the software. They had been searching for a better sword, and they had discovered that their enemy had built a godlike nervous system. Their entire conception of warfare, of mass, of attrition, of central command, was a relic. They had been thinking about the wrong problem. They were profoundly, dangerously, and completely wrong. The report from Directorate S landed on the desk of the General Secretary like a death sentence. It was a stark, brutal document, stripped of all ideological varnish. It detailed the American system. It explained the industrial and technological gap. It concluded that the Soviet Union's massive investment in conventional armored forces was now, effectively, worthless against a first-tier NATO opponent. The first reaction from the Politburo was denial, then fury. An order was given, a classic, desperate command from a system that knew only one way to solve a problem. Copy it. Screw for screw. I want a Soviet version of this system in 5 years. The engineers at the design bureaus and research institutes knew it was impossible, but they had no choice but to try. They were commanded to replicate a miracle, and their failure would be absolute. They attempted to copy the American microprocessors. Their versions, produced in their less advanced fabrication plants, were larger, slower, and consumed 10 times the power. They were useless. They tried to build the miniaturized radar sensors. Their attempts were plagued by defects. The rejection rate on the assembly line was over 90%. The few that worked were nowhere near as sensitive or reliable as the American originals. The most significant failure was systemic. The Soviet system could not replicate the software and the network architecture. Their command and control philosophy was rigidly hierarchical. Information flowed up the chain, decisions flowed down. The American system was a distributed network. It pushed intelligence and decision-making authority to the edges. It was fast, adaptable, and resilient. The Soviets tried to bolt their new, inferior hardware onto their old, rigid command structure. It was like trying to wire a supercomputer with a telephone switchboard. The result was a clumsy, ineffective parody of the American system. It was a scarecrow dressed in a soldier's uniform. The attempt to copy the hardware without understanding the underlying philosophy was a catastrophic failure. It only served to highlight how far behind they truly were. The microchip had defeated the smokestack, and no amount of political will could reverse that verdict. The final scorecard was never written in a public document, but it was calculated in the most secret chambers of the general staff. The war games were run again, this time with the new American system factored in. The results were apocalyptic. In every simulation, the vanguard of the Red Army in Germany was annihilated within the first hour of a hypothetical conflict. The projected loss ratios were not 2-1 or 3-1, the acceptable calculus of industrial warfare. They were 50-1, 100-1. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The tank, the icon of Soviet military power for half a century, had been turned into a mobile coffin. This realization sent a shockwave through the entire Soviet system. It was a quiet, internal collapse of confidence. The military leadership, for the first time, understood that they could not win a conventional war in Europe. Their primary strategic tool was broken. This technological humiliation was a key, if hidden, driver of the paranoia and desperation that defined the last decade of the Soviet Union. The fear of this conventional gap fueled their frantic investment in ever more exotic strategic weapons. It contributed to the terror inspired by America's Strategic Defense Initiative, which they saw as another technological leap that would render their nuclear deterrent, their last remaining trump card, obsolete. The economic strain of this last, desperate arms race was the final straw that broke the back of their inefficient command economy. The silent tanks in the Fulda Gap were an early symptom of the terminal illness that would kill the Soviet Empire. The failure was not in the courage of their soldiers or the genius of their tank designers. The failure was systemic. It was a flaw in the very DNA of their state. A centralized, top-down, authoritarian system is good at focusing immense resources on a single, well-defined problem, like building thousands of simple, rugged tanks. But it is terrible at fostering the kind of decentralized innovation, the complex integration, the free flow of information required to create a system of systems. They prized control above all else. The new form of warfare prized autonomy. They believed in the power of mass. The new warfare believed in the power of information. It was a war between two philosophies, and one had been proven decisively superior. The legacy of this secret revolution is the very foundation of modern warfare. The concepts of network-centric operations, of the reconnaissance strike complex, of precision engagement, all born in those quiet California labs, are now the unquestioned doctrine of every advanced military on Earth. The zone of silence was not an anomaly. It was the future arriving, unannounced, and utterly unforgiving. It was the moment that information replaced steel as the primary currency of power on the battlefield. The Cold War was ultimately not won by spies, or by proxy wars, or even by economic output alone. It was won by a fundamental asymmetry in the ability to process reality. One side built a system that saw the battlefield with perfect clarity and could act with inhuman speed. The other built a system that blinded its own soldiers with ideology and paralyzed its own generals with bureaucracy. The future did not belong to the side with the most tanks. It belonged to the side with the fastest thoughts.